Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So happy to be here. I'm Reverend Lane Cobb. I am the host and founder of Race Talk Revolution Incorporated. And I am here today with my co-host, AJ Woodson, editor-in-chief of Black Westchester Magazine and co-host of People Before Politics Radio. Welcome to another episode of Race Talk Revolution, where your voice matters. Our topic today is Our Latinx Heritage, Remembering Who We Are. Joining us are Addys Castillo and Nic Rodriguez Villafane. Ms. Castillo is Executive Director of Citywide Youth Coalition Incorporated in New Haven, Connecticut, and a key member of Colectivo Bambula, which addresses anti-Blackness through the uplifting of Afro-descendencia and engaging in the nuances of Puerto Rican culture. Nic Rodriguez Villafane is a writer, educator, artist, and organizer. Their work brings liberation and healing to the Puerto Rican community through education, cultural preservation, and community organizing. As always, during our conversation today, we ask that you remain muted. And then when we get to the Q&A section, we will advise you how to raise your hand. And during that time, we will invite you to come on camera and voice your questions to our speakers. You can also go ahead and put your questions into the chat. We also remind you that Race Talk Revolution is a safe and brave space for people of all backgrounds to share ideas and opinions and explore the nuances of systemic racism while together growing our capacity for anti-racist activism. The Race Talk Revolution community is committed to practicing radically inclusive love so that even when we don't agree with something that is being shared, we listen with respect, appreciation, and empathy, because it is our commitment that every person be encouraged, appreciated, and heard, because on Race Talk Revolution, every voice matters. So I'm going to go ahead and read the bios for our speakers, and then I'm going to turn the mic over to AJ Woodson to begin the Q&A. Addys Castillo is a public servant by day and performance artist by night. She is a public administrator with over 29 years of experience working across intersecting systems, serving and organizing vulnerable populations. Addys is most passionate about working towards dismantling systems of oppression that impact our most vulnerable communities. As the executive director of the Citywide Youth Coalition Incorporated in New Haven, Connecticut, she organizes and convenes youth, community members, and youth-serving organizations towards building a courageous community where young people lead change. Addys is a National Urban Fellow and holds a BA in Sociology from Central Connecticut State University, a Master of Science in Criminal Justice, and Professional Certificate in Forensic Psychology from the University of New Haven, along with a Master of Public Administration from the City of New York, Baruch College's School of Public Affairs. She is a first-year student at UConn Law School. Girlfriend, when do you have time to breathe? Nic Rodriguez Villafane is a non-binary, Florida-raised, Philly-based Boricua. They are a writer, educator, DJ, and brujx in the Luccumi religion. For more than a decade, they have served the community as a social justice organizer and researcher. A former Leeway Foundation Arts and Change Grant recipient, their writing has been featured in an array of creative, academic, and editorial publications such as the Philadelphia Inquirer, NASW Press Journal for Social Work, and the Gordian Review. Nic holds an MFA in creative writing from Rutgers University in Newark. Some of their current creative projects include serving as a co-editor for Sana Sana, Latinx Pain and Radical Visions for Healing and Justice, an anthology which will be published by Common Notions Press in the spring of 2023. Their scholarship explores the ways in which Boricua diasporic moments of cultural performance go beyond revolutionary moments of declaration, but rather are creating futuristic possibilities, highlighting the ways a people can make language, rememory, and new ways of being. They currently are a first-year PhD student at UCSD Theater and Drama Department. Wow. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for taking time out of your, what I can only imagine is an extremely busy schedule, to be with us today. We are so honored to have you. Thank you for helping us to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. What I'd like to do is start the Q&A, first of all, please, by asking you both to talk a little bit about the work you do as community organizers, committed to liberation and healing in the Latinx community, and specifically to the Puerto Rican community in the United States. If you could just do that, and then AJ will pick up where I left off.
Buenas tardes, good afternoon. Man, that's a loaded question. And to answer that, I gotta give you some historical context on how Nic and I met in doing this work. So when the pandemic hit, actually, this goes even before the pandemic. There was a road to this. So as you stated before, I am the executive director of the Citywide Youth Coalition in New Haven. I've been at the job now 7 years. Woo, 7 years passed by like this, especially with the organizing work. I got into the work as someone who used to be a criminal justice practitioner. I definitely want to highlight that. I'm an organizer now because I used to work in jails. I used to be responsible for sending court reports that'll get your kids taken away or get your freedom taken away. And for a long time, when I did that work, I thought that I was like there to create change, you know, especially working for the State Department. You know, you think I'm gonna become a social worker and social workers preserve families. And then you go work for the state and you find out, no, you're a glorified paper pusher and your job is to cover the backside of the state so they're not liable. And in the end, you end up breaking up families more so than you do preserving them. So in that work, I thought, you know, that my commitment was to do service work and that was going to save people. And when I got into my position as executive director, I got excited because I wanted to organize. I was like, bet, I've done direct service, but the work doesn't work if we're not changing policy. That was my focus. We're going to change policy. And when I called people to the table to do the work, nobody showed up. People were more interested in, hey, you can go advocate for me at City Hall or at the state to make sure I keep my money in the budget so that we can keep serving people. But as far as changing policies, nah, we do that later. The service comes first. So when I couldn't get people to like adults to the table, I was like, man, what am I doing wrong? And at the same time, I ran into this collective in New Haven called Just Moves. And they were a group of anti-racist organizers who were in the arts, who were in public service, who had brought this Undoing Racism workshop to the city of New Haven. And when they brought the workshop, it kind of changed the way that they were doing things specifically because they wanted to build upon the work that already existed on the ground, but just wanted to give people a different kind of lens. And they had decided that they wanted to do a youth workshop. So as the gatekeeper of youth programs in the city of New Haven, they had to come see me. So I got invited to the table to help organize a workshop, never having been through the workshop myself or having a lens for that work. And when I went through it, I had like a mind-blowing epiphany. And a couple things came to light. One, I'm not crazy. Oh my God, the things that I've been experiencing all my life are not in my head. Two, I've been thinking all this time that this is about saving people, when the truth is, this is about first getting me right. And two, how do I move people along with me so we can be about the business of changing what we don't like? And the third thing that came to mind was I didn't realize how much I had grown a disdain for being a Latina, specifically because I've always felt invisibilized in Latino spaces. People see me, they see a Black woman. They don't see a Latina. Many times I had to go and prove who I was and what have you. So I want to ground that on that work that I came into this space of awakening and wanting to learn more and unpack what that relationship was. But in the process of unpacking my relationship with my Latinidad, I started to wanted to get more closer to my culture. Like, what exactly was it about my culture that I was running away from? And as someone who was a dancer before music came along, to me, dancing was my soul thing. I went through a couple of trainings and I wanted to, instead of dancing for the purposes of like just hip hop, I wanted to start dancing the things that my ancestors danced. And I stumbled upon bomba. And in the process of discovering bomba, like I started to bring that conversation into other spaces, and that conversation came with a lot of language. So bomba, in case you don't know what bomba is the music of resistance of La Isla de Puerto Rico. When our ancestors landed in the island, most people think that we all spoke the same language. That's not correct. Even Africans didn't all speak the same language. People think Africa is like a city or is a country, is a continent. We're over 36 countries, and never mind how many people live there, how many tribes, how many nations live there, you know, different languages. Everybody didn't speak the same language. So when you had Africans being brought into Puerto Rico, and not just Puerto Rico, but the Caribbean and South America, Central America, they were dropping us off over here first before they started doing the colonization process and what is now the United States. All this racial construct started being cultivated in the islands, in South America, in Latin America, just to kind of put it in perspective. But we didn't all speak the same language. So you had Africans being enslaved and oppressed by Spaniards, who were then also oppressing and killing the indigenous people of the island. So the three of us all started getting together and being mixed in together. And that meant that we had to figure out ways to communicate. And we did that through music. We did that through the drums. And it's important to understand that, because in understanding that, you understand why we use music as a way to resist. So bomba is that in particular. How did we preserve our culture? Because this practice is over 400 years old and it's been passed down from generation to generation, and it evolves. But for the most part, this is what bomba was for. So in cultivating that relationship with bomba, and I think I started really being a practitioner in 2019, we have this moment of everybody had to stand still. And that was the moment of COVID. When COVID hit, none of us could, practice. We started getting in online platforms. And that is how Nic and I met. Because one of our co-founding friends, Rosalyn Sotero, she decided that, we have all this literature, and Rosalind is also an organizer who I work with here in Connecticut, also an artist. So she decided to cultivate this space for us to do a building through reading literature that was created by Puerto Ricans, just to create a space specifically during the pandemic to be connected. And in that space, we went from wanting to just read books and talk about books and having authors talk about their work to wanting to have political conversation and conversations about identity and healing that kind of naturally evolved. So one day she put out a call to arms for all of us to show up at this meeting to so what is this? We called it the Bodhi Book Club is what it was initially. What do we want to become? So from there, a couple of us got together and decided that we wanted to be about and really looking at anti-Blackness, looking at how we've been racialized, looking at how this continues to oppress the way that we live as a people, not just on the island, but also in the mainland, to the point that we started to erase our own identity in order to fit into the American dream. So that is where this collective started. And what happened is when we were, I think in one sitting, we came up with our mission, our vision, our values, but we didn't have a name. And it just so happened as we were thinking about a name, I had just sat through a lecture with Alex Lasalle of Alma Moyo, which is a bomba band out of New York, Westchester, New York, in the city. And he gave this lecture, he talked about the word bambula. I love the way it rolls off your tongue, bambula. Bambula is a Congo word, right? It's a Congo word, but in bomba, it means it's a rhythm and it's a dance. But the translation of bambula in Congo, it means to remember. And that is essentially what we don't do, right? We don't know who we are as a people because we've been forced to forget. Think about that. You, even as a Puerto Rican coming into the mainland, you got to give up your language. You got to give up your accent. Tú no eres Juan, you're John. Tú no eres Erika, tú eres Erica. You got to give up who you are to be here. And as that result of us continuously trying to move closer to mejorando la raza and getting closer to whiteness, which is a whole nother topic in and of itself, we start to forget who we are. So we don't know where we stand. So what ends up happening when we have these conversations about racial justice, Puerto Ricans, Latinos in general, sit on the sideline goes, this is a black and white conversation. This one got nothing to do with me, because we've forgotten who we are. We have forgotten who we are. So even as we're having this conversation and Latino Heritage Month, Hispano Heritage Month, whatever they want to call it, I highlight this thing. One, when we talk about Latino heritage, we're essentially talking about celebrating our Europeanness. We're not talking about celebrating Blackness. We're not talking about celebrating our indigeneity, which is why most of the time when folks when this month rolls around, they're quick to try to grab people at the last minute to have conversations. But the conversation we haven't unpacked is the anti-Blackness that lives within our own community, because that's how we've been colonized, to get as far away as possible from everything that makes us part of the folks who were enslaved, to be much more aligned with what is now considered power. So I want to pause there because I know Nic has plenty to contribute from here as we tag team, because we built this vision together back in 2020. And here we are 2 years later, still trying to hold space for not just Puerto Ricans to get together, because originally that was our goal. Puerto Ricans, we need to get our act together. We act like we don't know what's going on. But what has evolved is that this is a healing space for all Latinos, because we've all been racialized. And the way that we've been racialized has caused us to be violent towards each other, to completely invisibilize each other's pain, and more importantly, to work against each other as we try to build a movement. Nic, you're it.
Before Nic speaks, I just want to say to you, I love you. You've answered questions 1 through 4 already, like that I had written down. You've already went through the questions, but go ahead, Nic.
Thank you so much. And no, true. I'm like, Addys is gonna lay it down very clearly. And I was looking through the questions to make sure there wasn't too much overlap. But thank you, folks. Good afternoon, buenas tardes, good morning. If you are located where I am at currently, which is the West Coast. I have been here now on the West Coast for approximately less than 3 weeks. So this is all new to me. I'm happy to be here with you all to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart. As Addys mentioned, Addys and I reconnected on our work with Colectivo Bambula about 2 years ago. And what I wanted to highlight during that period, what I noticed from the folks who were attending the book club, who were and we were doing it monthly. We were having Puerto Ricans and folks of the diaspora. So when we say the diaspora, those Puerto Ricans that are not located on the mainland. And diaspora is going to come up a lot in my work, and also the continued work of organizing against anti-Blackness really is a diasporic project. Because if you know the history of Puerto Rico, you know that it is, and if you don't know, Puerto Rico remains one of the oldest colonies in the world. Puerto Rico is still a colony of the United States, which means a couple of different layers. It means that the Puerto Ricans on the island do not have particular voting rights, although they are forced, and if they were forced, would have to be drafted in order to be in the military. So they are forced to be drafted in the military, but then cannot vote for a president. It also means that certain laws and legislations impact the island. One of them specifically, you may have noticed in the news recently, is known as the Jones Act. So the Jones Act was an act that was instated by the US government. And this specific act, what it did is it gave rights, maritime rights, to the shipping yards for the United States, which meant that Puerto Rico could not bargain or could not trade and import with other countries and other Caribbean nations as well. It meant that the only country that was allowed to sort of come in and out was the United States. Recently, that particular legislation was lifted temporarily because of what we're seeing happening right now with Hurricane Fiona. And I almost said Hurricane Maria because Hurricane Maria was only 5 years ago. And so what we saw was that Puerto Ricans were not able to receive aid from the US government because of this particular act. And we're not able to receive aid from other countries who wanted to come in and to help the island. So first, we have to understand that Puerto Rico is still a colony and is still dealing with the effects of a colonial government, both the United States and also the Spanish. The resistance movement of Puerto Rico has been going on for more than 100 years. So that's something else I want to highlight. I think folks, we tend to, in our broader public knowledge amongst Puerto Ricans, think that the movement for independence or the movement for revolution is something that just happened yesterday, or it's, within the last 5 years because of the internet and our information to access one another and to access this history and information. when the reality is resistance movements on the island have been ongoing for hundreds of years. Part of that resistance movement, many of that was founded by Black communities in Puerto Rico. So Addys mentioned it briefly. One of the cities and one of the towns that oftentimes come up in these conversations is the town of Loíza in Puerto Rico. Loíza was founded in the 1600s by slaves who had escaped. So it's also one of the first slave towns or towns created by slaves, former slaves in the United States in the 1600s. And it was a town in which the slaves then began to create jobs, schoolings, communities, art, performance, and it's still one of the most vibrant Afro Latino towns in Puerto Rico, or Afro-Boricua towns. It's mentioned often, but there are Afro-Boricuas all over the island. So I do want to highlight that as well, is that while Loíza is often spoken about as like the Afro-Boricua town, rich with arts and culture, there are other pockets throughout the island. In my own case, or in my own story, many Puerto Ricans find themselves in the diaspora because of the conditions that were on the island. Many had to go to the United States to find work. Many were forced to be in the military, which would happen to many of my family members. I come from a large military family. And within Puerto Rico, there is a sordid history of sterilization of Puerto Rican women. So this sterilization of Puerto Rican women really began to occur within the late 30s, 40s, up until almost the mid 60s, where the women of the island were being sterilized unbeknownst to them. They had no idea that this was happening to their reproductive systems. My grandmother was part of that legacy. And also my mom was part of that legacy of doctors sort of experimenting with her sort of reproductive rights. So as a result, and as a result of the other conditions, my family moved from Puerto Rico in the late 80s and early 90s, and we ended up in Florida. We did not end up in Miami, which many sort of Latinos that begin to migrate to Florida end up in Miami. We did not end up in Miami. We did not even end up in Orlando, which you see in the 2000s. You see sort of this large boom of Puerto Ricans moving to Orlando, to where Orlando is lovingly known as the 79th municipality of Puerto Rico. It's sort of a joke amongst community members. We did not move to Orlando. We moved in this really small town called Holly Hill, next to Daytona Beach, Florida. And if you know Florida, you know that Florida still is reeling and grappling with the politics and the vestiges of Jim Crow South. And so we were a small Puerto Rican family, single mother, living in a predominantly Black neighborhood in Holly Hill. And a lot of my racialization as a person happened in Florida and happened underneath the condition of a binary that was really, issues of race was Black and white. And if you know the history of the South with race, you know how these types of two-dimensional binaries does not capture the whole experience. So myself as a young person growing up, I never had a conceptualization of race in terms of the way the United States saw it. And so one story I like to tell with how messed up sort of the project of race was, is a story that I remember. I was about maybe 7 years old, and the census, the United States Census representative, came to my house to begin to start counting who lived in the household. And part of that, what they do is they ask folks, or they write down for folks specifically what their race is. And during that census count, I come from a multiracial family. My mother is white in terms of from her family, sort of from Spain. But then my grandfather and then my father's side of the family are all multiracial, indigenous, and Black. So when the census person came and began to take sort of the race of each of the family members, the census person had marked my mother as being white, my brothers as being mulatto, myself as white, and my grandfather as Black, because my grandfather at the time lived with us. And I remember my grandfather joking to us because he overheard what the census person was doing. And my grandfather said, "Y tu abuelo dónde está?" Which is translated roughly, and where's your grandfather at? Meaning what he was sort of joking and pointing out to was in that demarcation of race within our family, what happened was an erasure of our experience racially. We weren't mulattoes, we weren't white, we were Puerto Rican, and we saw so much of our identity as being Puerto Rican rather than being racialized. So much of our racialization as a people and as a family happened as a result of the United States, and happened as a result of how the United States historically has defined race, which we know has been pretty messed up and is not accurate to the whole perspective. I tell that story because that type of ideology has translated then to many Puerto Rican communities, where the idea of whiteness and mejorando la raza, which is a term that Addys use, right, to make the race better. Race is a colonial project. And so a lot of the ideology around race is also still the ideology of a colonial government, that we are going to reduce a human being based on our perceptions of what we think the value is of their personhood based on the color of their skins, which really, that's really what it comes down to, right? And so for many Puerto Ricans will say the issues of race, that has nothing to do with me. Puerto Ricans, we are a mix of everything. We are indigenous, we are Black, we are white, we are Spaniard, we are a mix. The problem though is using that type of mythology, that we are all a mixed people, adamantly denies our Blackness and is actually anti-Black, because that sort of phrase of we are a mixture of everybody denies for the most part our own sort of Afro-descendant Black history. And it's used as an excuse to not talk about or address the issues that Black Puerto Ricans and that Black Latinos all over the diaspora actually end up facing. And so getting to be a part of Colectivo Bambula aligned completely with my work as an organizer. I've been an organizer now for about 15 years. A lot of my work is around racial justice work and also prison abolition work. And I did this heavy in Philadelphia. But part of that is using the arts to tell stories, using performing arts to tell one's own personal narrative, to share, to be a cultural connector, to be a historical learning moment. And I was really fixated by seeing the way in which art seemed to bridge all of these histories and knowledges and stories and really brought people and commune people together. So as a scholar, which I'm here now at University of California in San Diego, a lot of my work focuses on the way in which performing arts spaces, particularly for Puerto Rican, but all across the diaspora, Latino diaspora, that arts become a place of which people are gathering, people are remembering, people are gaining access to knowledge that they did not have access to. They are sharing and exchanging knowledge. And beyond just connecting, they are being grounded and finding a sense of who they are. And our work with Colectivo Bambula, we specifically emphasize and focus on our Afrodescendencia and our Black history in Puerto Rico, because in focusing in that, it then unlocks and it opens up all of these other stories, all of these performances, all of these arts. And it helps us address our own internalized anti-Blackness that many of us maybe did not know we were even aware of that we had as a people. And so with Colectivo Bambula, we really saw that there was a hunger. And that's the thing that I think filled up my soul in joining and doing this work with Colectivo Bambula, which with the pandemic, we saw people were hungry for connection. People were hungry to be in community. And when we would do the book talks, we did a number of workshops around many topics. We saw Puerto Ricans and just folks in general who were gathering from all across the country to have these conversations. And so we saw that there is a yearning that people have particularly around talking about these issues, but maybe just don't have access either in their homes or in their schools or where it has been. And so we're really excited to sort of continue this work with organizing and with bringing about sort of these conversations and topics with our communities across the country and across the diaspora.
Great. You've answered several of the questions I have listed here as well. But I wanted to touch upon a few things that you said, but before I do that, this is a personal question as a journalist. I know white people try to define us, and I'm seeing the term Latinx used more now. And I know you don't speak for all Hispanics, but is that a term that y'all came up with or that was given to y'all? Do you still prefer the term Latinos or Latinx? I just, so when I'm writing, I know kind of sort of, I've been asking this a lot lately to kind of get a consensus of what y'all want. So.
No, that's a really great question. And I'll try to just summarize it very quickly, which is first understanding that these terms, Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, these are terms that were created in the United States, actually.
Right.
And Hispanic and particularly Latino in the 80s was used and created amongst thinkers, amongst scholars in the United States, and especially those in the government, specifically for the census. They wanted to figure out a way in which to like gather all the Latinos that were in the United States. And so they did a campaign, particularly around the word Latino. If you go on YouTube, you can find sort of some of these old commercials for this particular campaign. So I want to just say that history to say that language evolves, and you're absolutely right in which not everybody identifies as Latinx. For some reason, Latinx has people up in arms. It's controversial. It's changing Latinidad, but the reality is Latino also was not a word that existed before and then was created. And so Latinx was created to be a more gender inclusive, right? Because much of the Spanish language is still heavily gendered. You know, you either have masculine or feminine. And Latinos, right? Typically, whenever there's just one male figure in a room, it could be a number of Latinas, a number of women, it's automatically casted as Latino. So it's also a project, Latinx is also a project to take away sort of the insistence that we have with gender. So it's an all-inclusive term. What I tell for folks, if you feel like you identify with Latinx, use it. If you don't have to use it. For journalists, I find journalists typically will do like the slashes. So they'll say Latinx, Latino, Latina, either is fine. I know folks that, myself included, that use Latinx that also are fine with Latino, right? And I think it's just part of understanding that language evolves in the way that communities and people evolve.
Now let me ask you, and this may go a little off the topic too, but you know, we have an election coming up. And one of the things I'm realizing that the politicians don't understand, they want to lump all Hispanic speaking people into one voice, like y'all are all Democrat or y'all are all Republican or y'all all believe one thing. And I wanted to give you a chance to address that because like African Americans or Black people, there are many different, you know, we come and we believe different stuff and y'all do too. And I wanted to address that, especially with an election coming up in 5 weeks, you know. And y'all are, in your voice, in your vote, like the Black vote is very taken for granted.
We are not a monolith. I want to put
there
that
you
out
go.
there.
That's the word I was looking for.
We are not a monolith.
That's the word I was looking for.
But I will say this. Latinos overall, and this is a generalization and just an observation on my end as a social scientist from the sidelines, no research included. Those of us who align ourselves with capitalism and this idea of constant prosperity tend to lead more towards Republican-esque policy. I will say that. Those of us who tend to be a little more radical or kind of buck against that system, I wouldn't even say that we recognize ourselves as Democrats, because the folks who are that evolved recognize that it's the same coin. It's the same coin, just a different side. You know, and it's really about how do we collectively build political power that falls outside of those parameters to begin with? So we are not a monolith. I couldn't say that enough. There's always usually the characterization. Same thing I kind of observed. If you look at like the news when Castro died, and they were highlighting what was going on in Florida, and it was like a mixed crowd, right? Because the folks who were happy about his death were like the Republican-esque folks, and they don't look nothing like myself, right? But the folks who were still living there and who were aligned with the regime look a little more darker in hue. So it kind of makes you go, hey, different perspectives, but understand even when we have this racialized conversation, in the island, we have race. I want to make sure we understand that. And I say that specifically when you start looking at power. Who's in charge and what do they look like? The people who are usually in charge of the island, what do they look like? They don't look like me. Right. Are they poor? No, they got money. And if we look how colonialism, as Nic was referring to, kind of grew on the island, even I'm doing some like awesome reading right now because yes, Nic, books save lives, right? Books save lives.
I like that shirt. Yes.
Slave revolts in Puerto Rico. Like you can't get into this organizing work, you can't get into even artist work without really having an understanding of the history that we haven't been told. One of the exciting projects that we have coming up for Colectivo Bambula is that the next book club is going to be a series on unpacking the book by what my man's name, last name Dennis, La Guerra contra los Puertorriqueños, the war against all Puerto Ricans, where it shows you the highlight how Puerto Ricans have always been under attack by the government, not just the US government, but even under Spanish rule. You know, the Spanish were starting to give us our freedom, and then swoops in the Spanish-American War, and we're still right back into the same enslavement that we were in before. But all of that stuff is critical because, you know, even when we started this conversation, we do things from a perspective of anti-racism, and I'm really glad that Bambula has evolved into what it is that we all have an understanding of how race is playing out against us. We have an understanding of that, and we're real intentional about how we move. That's why we bring history into the room, because we got to remember. People forget quickly. You got to remind them. Like, people think it's Ian, when technically you're right, Nic. You highlighted Maria, and then we can highlight even more. We can go back to Katrina. We can keep going to Hugo and go on and so forth. Same exact problem, just under a different name. So yeah, let me hold my horses there because I know you got some more conversation for us under those questions.
So I recently, well, a couple of years ago, I interviewed Willie Colon. I had a nice long conversation with him and his activism and stuff. And one of the things he talked about is what people don't know, like in the 60s, Hispanics and Blacks worked well together, but we've allowed ourselves to be driven apart between the two groups and within our groups. So that being said, how do we bring African-American and Latino communities together around equity and justice? Because that's where we were, and we've allowed ourselves to be, divided, I guess, because too powerful for us to be working together. So,
Nic, I instantly think of music as the first place that conversation lives in for me. So in my work at Citywide, we organized one of the largest protests in Connecticut back in 2020. It brought out almost 7,000 people from what I understand the last time they did a count. And in the middle of that protest, we brought bomba. We started playing bomba in the middle of that protest, specifically, not to just bring the ancestors into the space, but to remind the Latinos who were present and who were on fire for anti-police violence to recognize that this is not about saving Black people, but we are also in the same equation. We confuse, we don't know. And it kind of brought me back, AJ, you're highlighting that there was a time when we were together. I think about the time of the Young Lords and the Black Panthers, because the Young Lords platform came directly from that of the Black Panthers. But specifically, what has changed from then to now is that Latinos have been invited into whiteness. Latinos have been invited into whiteness. And when we got an invitation into whiteness, we took a sideline. Just like when we organized, we took care of our communities before the 501c3 status, and then we went to sleep. because, oh, well, we got this passed, we good, we can go sit down. Even kind of like what's happening now. We elected Biden and a Black woman, so therefore we can go have a seat. No, it continues. But yeah, I just want to highlight that we specifically brought Black music to the protest to start building the bridge between the folks who are Latino, who don't understand that this is yours too, and this fight involves you, and that all of us, and this includes even white folks. White folks ain't exempt from this conversation, because I think about the Latinos and Latinas and Latinx folks who we come across, especially in the Bambula space, who present as white, who are featured, people usually mistake them for white, who feel very much like struggling to be connected to this movement by virtue of appearance. So I love that we utilize arts as a bridge, because it's all about using culture to start bringing humanity back into spaces. I'm gonna tag team over to Nic, because I know Nic got some brilliance too on this topic.
No, thank you, Alex. I love how you stated that the art, and culture sort of bridges people together. In my work around the movement for racial justice, a very simple question that I always pose out there when we get sort of bogged down into these sort of facts and statistics and histories and used to be, is the question of just who does this serve? And I say that in that when we talk about white supremacy is a very easy project. Racism is very easy. To put all your energy and hate towards difference because of the way that somebody looks or your idea of Blackness, racism is a lazy and easy project, because human beings are not simple. We are not one-dimensional. We have histories, we have stories, we have events, we have multiplicity even within our cultures, even within our practices, even within our languages. And oftentimes, what I have found in my work and my research and my lived experience is that white supremacy doesn't want a multiplicity. White supremacy wants to render us as one-dimensional human beings, that our worth and our existence is based off of a system that really was just designed for power, designed for conflict. And so what I feel like arts and culture does is that it connects us in the multiplicities of ourselves. And so when these questions of like race come up within particularly Latino communities, I always preface that question of, who is this particular event serving right now? To go back to that question of like the way that Latinos vote, yes, Latinos are not a monolith. We are very different, in our political views and values. But the question of the Latino vote has consistently come up every single election. Every 4 years, all of a sudden MSNBC is interested in the Latino vote. Every election, they want to know how to focus in. They want to see, oh, Latinos are voting differently. Yes, because Latinos reflect the politics of the countries of which Latinos are in, right? I will say that those that are aligning themselves with the value systems of white supremacy is very different than sort of most. And I want to give Latinos the benefit of the doubt that a lot of times is that politically, white supremacy doesn't even allow us to have political difference. White supremacy does not even allow us to have different political thought or different ways of being. And that is a lot of the project in the United States, is that we are a multiracial, multi-immigrant, multi-sexual, multi-gendered country, and we always have been. But the project of reducing our narratives as simple as possible is a lazy and it's an easy project. Puerto Ricans, particularly, but other Latinos, for me personally, I've never saw Puerto Rican history or Black history as separate. And Addys mentioned music being one area. I think, for example, the creation of hip hop. I'm a big hip hop head. I'm a big reggaeton head. I consider reggaeton as the daughter of hip hop, to quote Catalina Excleton, who's an amazing reggaeton scholar. Definitely check her out. But even the creation of hip hop music, which is seen as it's Black music, Puerto Ricans were right there.
From the beginning.
were there from the beginning. It was
Yes.
always Puerto Ricans and Black folks, or Puerto Ricans and other Latinos, because there were Panamanians, there were also folks from the Caribbean that were part of hip hop. So yes, I feel like music and arts and culture connect people to themselves and to their hearts and to their spirits in a way in which a lot of the el político or the politics don't necessarily do. And that's why I see arts and culture as not only just connecting, but it gives folks a safe space to begin to question these systems, to begin to question the world around them, and the enjoyment of being able to do that in an art form. That affect and that impact is what I'm most fascinated by.
I'm also a very big hip hop head, and I remember in the beginning, you know, there were a lot. There, you know, Blacks and Hispanics worked together, and the Caribbeans, and you know, Kool Herc is from the Caribbean. He's one of the founders of hip hop, and you know, you had Charlie Chase and them that was with Cold Crush and Crazy Legs and them, you know, from Rocksteady. So I love that analogy, and I've always felt, being a hip hop head, I'm a music person. I got a lyric in my head for everything that goes on in my life. Like, I'm just that person. There's a lyric for everything in life. And I wanted, artistic expression plays a big part in your work, and we spoke about that. And how does art deliver healing and liberation from racial wounding? Either one of y'all that want to grab that one.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, because it looked like, Addys, you have a thought there. Do you want to finish that thought? In my own work, I say that arts particularly get us connected to our heart. Oftentimes, I think that people connect with different forms of art, because arts and the humanities, it's what connects us to make us feel most human. And I think that once we begin to sort of settle into our bodies first of what impacts our heart, then we can sort of open up and begin sort of those larger questions of healing. It's difficult to sort of ascribe the kinds of healings that can take place in music unless you are sort of witnessing it for yourself. In my case, I have utilized performance art spaces so that particularly young people and young LGBT folks can feel like they have an outlet to express the art inside them and express the stories that they have told. And they've utilized art to sort of create voices in ways in which they didn't have. And so that affect and that impact, you feel sort of the synergy and the energy of folks as part of that healing, right? You hear a song, you mentioned it to yourself, AJ, you have a line for every sort of experience in your life, right? You hear a song and it reminds you of something, it taps in. Art sometimes also has that way of connecting us to memories that maybe we didn't think about before that felt safe. Art has a way of rememory as well. What are the new things that are created in this enactment of this performance or of this art specifically? Art for me and how it functions with healing is that oftentimes what healing for me is, pain is telling us that something is wrong, right? Something is wrong, something needs to be addressed, something hurts. Healing in the arts, I think, facilitates a way and facilitates a channel to express what is wrong, to express the pain that is hurt, and to express it safely. And once you can begin to talk about and express those things which hurt us, that maybe we can't talk about because maybe we're still experiencing that hurt, art facilitates a way in which we can express it. We can connect with other people who are perhaps also experiencing this. And it's a way in which this moment or this feeling can live and right? Because once you create that piece of art, it's there in the world and in the universe, and you can revisit it. So you can take that pain and put that pain in that art, or you can have it, you know, when you want to sort of draw back on it, or you want to ask more questions of it. So I really see art as sort of a channel and sort of a conduit of the kinds of healing that I think Latinos, and I think particularly Puerto Ricans in my work, but all people really can benefit from.
Absolutely. And in the early days of hip hop, when hip hop started going from the Bronx downtown to the village clubs, that's when you really saw the merging of everybody. And, you know, we got to see people that we normally didn't see and party with them and realize they wasn't so different. And the rebellious spirit in hip hop brought identified with the rebellious spirit of what they were feeling, and we all connected and just partied. And you know what I'm saying? And that, yeah, so I agree. Did you want to add something to this? Or I'm going to the next question.
Just ditto to all of that. I can speak just only for the work that I've done in the last 3 years through arts. I told you before, I danced. That was my thing. That was the space that I felt most comfortable. And for a long time I didn't, because I didn't fit the mold of what society or white supremacy said I needed to be in order to be a dancer. So I never even called myself a dancer. I said things like, oh, I'm not a dancer, I just dance. Or I'm not a singer, I just sing. You know, we do that often, right? But I must say that since I've been in the practice of bomba, I started there dancing, and most of it, what spoke to me was that it wasn't choreography. It was essentially a conversation between myself and the drum. The drum beats to what I do, you know, not the other way, not me trying to follow the rhythm. And there was a freedom that came with that. And for that freedom, I, you know, kind of got really interested in learning more. So if I wanted to be a good dancer, I need to understand how you make the beats on the drum. So it got me into wanting to drum. And then from drumming, I got into this idea of singing and composing. And let me tell you, I sing in the shower. That was where I sung before. That was where I felt most comfortable. But the thing about a healing process is that you start to re-examine your inhibitions. You start to show up differently. Now I actually am the lead singer of, you know, the group that I travel with and what have you.
Oh.
And it amazes me even to this moment, because I would have never in my life would I've ever been someone to own that kind of a label, or even feel that my voice would be something that someone else wanted to hear. But that has a lot to do with the way that we've internalized how we see ourselves in spaces. And a lot of that internalization is built upon how we've been socialized to see who we are through the lens of the identities that we carry, whether we're woman, whether we're Black, Latinx, whether we're queer, whatever that label is, comes with some stigmas and some expectations that are unspoken. And the beauty of this work, because someone asked also, besides the, you know, the healing, is the organizing. You know, to me, the work about changing even white supremacy starts off with the conversation, and it's important to do healing work, because if you're damaged, if you're not correct, you ain't gonna be able to organize nobody else. I'm gonna put that out there again. It's important that you do your own healing work as we're doing this work, because a lot of times people go into this work wanting to save other folks. I'm gonna tell you again, like I've said it before, the work of undoing racism is not about saving anybody else, but saving yourself. It's about saving you, not having you tell me on chat what I'm supposed to call Puerto Ricans or people of color, not you showing up in spaces, you know, wanting to dictate how we have this conversation. Because my reality is my reality, Nic's reality is their reality, AJ, all of us come into this space wanting to get free. And the beauty of this work is that we don't gotta apologize no more. We get to show up as ourselves. That's the healing work. That's the freedom work. When people ask me all the time, what do you guys mean by liberation? And to me, it's simple. Liberation is being unafraid to be your freaking self in space.
Unapologetic.
You know what that is? You know how long it's taken for us to even get there? Like I do this work of teaching other folks about white supremacy as young as possible, because people need to understand that a lot of the way that we move is based upon how we've been taught to see people who look like us. And I want folks to understand, especially the white folks in this room, we've all been racialized. Y'all been racialized too. Y'all been racialized as safe. Y'all have been racialized as dominant folks over everything else. Y'all have been racialized as being perfect. And the truth is, y'all ain't none of that either. And a lot of, when you look at suicidal rates, when you look at like rates of alcoholism and things of that nature, white folks like to look at us and be like, y'all the problem. No, bruh, sis, y'all in it too. It's killing you too. You just don't see it because you're dying slowly. Your death is just happening a little more slowly. And the death that we're speaking to is the death of you looking at other people's humanities. We have a hard time at looking at our own humanity. And I recognize at this point that that has less to do with how I've been socialized, but it's really to do with how we've all internalized whiteness. So I want to kind of even pivot to even having that conversation. I'm not talking about you being a white person. I'm talking about how all of us internalize whiteness, white supremacy, how we live it, how we, even in this space, I was thinking about it as Lane was giving out our bio. That was like, damn, I sound pretentious as hell. And the truth is, in those 29 years, I ran and got all those degrees because no one took me seriously in rooms.
Absolutely.
I had to get a bunch of degrees because every time I opened my mouth, they would relegate me to the, you're just a Black woman, sit to the side, nobody understands what you, or let me go get this master's. You know what? Then you can only speak about that issue, go sit in that corner. Well, let me get this other master's. Well, you can only speak about those two issues, go sit in that corner. Even now, sitting in law school is the most oppressive place I've ever been in. And it's making me even question, what am I doing there? And I have to remember, I'm there to understand how this all moves and how I can serve my community. And how do I do that? To fight the white supremacy in that space is that I'm not in charge of changing people's minds in there. I'm there to get the same education they're there to get. No lie. Last week, I heard a conversation that blew my mind and it made me uncomfortable, but now looking back on it, I'm glad it was happening. A couple of students in my classroom were talking about being or speaking other languages. And it turns out two of the students in the room weren't born there. They were born in Europe, in Albania, and in another country, right? And they were talking about how they don't understand how people here don't want to hold on to their language. And then the young white woman who's sitting next to me, young white co-ed who's been nothing but helpful to me in the last couple of weeks, I must say, I was looking at folks with the side eye when I got into that space. She starts breaking down that, well, you got to understand, you know, we get shamed into thinking that we can't still hold on to our culture. A white woman was talking about not being able to hold on to her culture. And I shut up in that moment because I really wanted to jump in, but I was thinking to myself, nah, you know what I mean? Because I was thinking, I don't want to do any labor. Who is she to speak to my experience? And the reality is that's my boxed in thinking. How come she can't have the same experience? White people have it too, because you guys are taught to lose your culture. You're taught that no, in order to really gain the dream, you can't be speaking Polish up in here. You better change that up. You better change that Slavic name that you used to have into something else. You get taught how to talk. You get taught how to show up, and you get taught how to see people who look like me. Hey, look at that. We're all learning at the same time. But it was a beautiful moment in retrospect because I felt uncomfortable about what was happening next to me. And it just dawned on me now in this very moment that she was really explaining how they lose their culture too.
I see back to that Willie Colon interview when I said, you know, how we would separate it amongst African Americans and Latinos. He also spoke about how each of our groups, how we've been allowed them to separate us within our groups. And I noticed in the Black community, there's like a rift between Blacks who are descendants from slavery in this country and Blacks whose family migrated from other countries. And I was wondering, do you see that similar rift in Hispanic and Latino communities between longtime residents and recent migrants? Are communities divided by culture and country origin? Do you see?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. And again, it goes back to that question of like, well, what system is this serving? And it's serving white supremacy, right? And if you think about even the election, like you'll start to see those tensions come up even during the elections. I mean, one of the sort of political conundrums for me personally, especially during the elections, is watching the divisiveness of like staunchly proud Latinos, as they will say, that are also anti-immigrant, that are also anti, or that only speak one language. You know, you have to speak English when you get here. And all of that is tied into, again, fulfilling the prophecy, you know, fulfilling the self-prophecy or fulfilling the dreams and the goal of what white supremacy is, where we want people to speak English. We want people to look a certain way. We don't believe in immigrants, and that's it. And so you see that especially happen amongst Latinos. especially come around election time. But even amongst Latinos, there is divisiveness, and again, it goes back to white supremacy of tensions amongst Latinos, right? There was for some time, Puerto Ricans weren't considered great. I mean, if the Puerto Ricans were considered like at the bottom of the totem pole when it came to sort of Latinidad, because we spoke Spanish weird, we didn't speak Spanish correctly, but really all of that, as we talk about it a lot in our work, is a lot of that was also anti-Black, because we spoke Spanish like Caribbeans, because our Spanish had a lot of Black and African languages within it. We see the tensions even amongst Mexican Americans, right? Like, look at the stereotypes that exist amongst Mexicans. I had to check my own family members in Puerto Rico and also here in the United States on comments that they would make about Mexicans. Oh, they're always working in the fields. Oh, they're always doing this. Oh, they have a lot of family members when they come over. Oh, they're crossing the border illegally, right? Which is like, then I have to break it down and I have to get in fights with my family members. So again, you know, it's the project is so systemic. Of upholding white supremacy is so systemic. Colonialism is a project that works because it works, right? Like, they have implored colonialism because they saw that it does work. So these systems are going to continue to exist as long as those who are in power see them as working to maintain that particular type of power. And I think, to add on to Addie's point about like liberation, your most unapologetic, free self, part of liberation too is going to be the distribution of power, right? Because in order for us to really be our true liberated selves, we're going to have access to power that we are systematically denied and neglected this specific power. To achieve certain powers and shifts in society, it's going to mean that those who are in power are going to look different, are going to reflect us, right? And people always think about sort of presidential elections, but I'll take it even back and just like see within your own communities. Are you involved in your local politics? Because I tell folks all the time, your local politics, those that you're voting as your city council members, those that you're voting as superintendent, those that you're voting as commissioners, judges, all of those local policies, people don't vote in those elections, and yet they impact most directly sort of the stasis of your community at that time. And so I encourage folks, it's like, look at the way in which power is even distributed amongst your family members, in your schools, in your churches. You know, where are the places that you convene as a community? And so for that kind of liberation to exist, we have to like liberate our minds, our bodies, our hearts, our soul, and also recognize like we're gonna have to get some power that we have not had this type of power for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Lane, you want to open it up to the audience to get some questions in, and can you let them know how to do that?
Sure. Well, I had it instructed in the chat for folks to go ahead and put your questions in the chat. If you have questions, I definitely want to get this question about how do we get, you know, Black communities and brown communities together working for a common goal, because we have so much common history. And I just love that you're bringing that to people, because that is part of the remembering, right? Folks, if you want to ask your question in person, please go ahead. You can go to the bottom of your screen and where in the reactions button, hit that and it will help you to raise your hand. You can also find your name in the participants list and raise your hand that way. And if you do have a question, we're going to ask that you come onto camera. So AJ, is that our next question about coming together? What's our next question?
The next question, I'm looking.
I think that would be a good one.
Oh, go ahead. Then go ahead with that. Run with that.
Well, let's talk about that, right? As organizers, you know that organizers, we often lament about the rift that remains between, you know, the Black American community, the Latinx community. How do we all come together around this common goal for equity and justice? And why is it so hard for us to find that common ground so that we work together instead of apart? We keep, you know, kind of not coming together. How do you work towards that in your organizations if you do? What are your thoughts on that?
I create spaces, man. I love putting food on the table and inviting people to come through and say, we about to have some real conversation. And you can't do that without real relationships. See, I love how we go, hey, how do we bring community together? Well, who are you in relationship with in community? Because I think about that. I can have a party and I can invite people, but if the people I'm inviting don't know me, ain't nobody showing up to my party.
Right.
So I got to start first with the people who are closest to me. I think about what that looks like even for Bambula. We have a going thread. Whenever something pops up, that conversation needs to happen, we throw it on the chat. And next thing you know, hey, can we get a meeting so we can kind of talk about what we're going to do about this? But that has taken the last 2 years to build. And technically speaking, I knew Roz 2 years before that. So it's taken more like 4 years to build, right? You got to create spaces. I say food is always a great way to do that because we like to eat. But also, I think about ways to get people together around the idea of sharing culture. The easiest way I can grab folks together is, hey, let's potluck. And I'm looking to have a conversation on why we don't work together. And be real clear, we're going to have this conversation because the couple people going to show up. The people who are nosy, who just want to see who going to spill some tea, and the people who got something to say because they're pissed off about how things currently are. I'm not worried about who's not showing up, but I'm going to start working with the people who show up first, right? That's the first thing. We got to create spaces for that. The other thing, and I think Annie put it in the chat, is that even after we have those talks, we still have to understand that having those kind of conversations require us having shared language. If we don't got shared language, I'll be talking about bananas, AJ's gonna be talking about apples, Nick's gonna be talking about oranges. We're gonna have a fruit salad, but we're still not gonna get to what we're trying to get to. We're trying to break an apple pie, and here we are, we're a fruit salad. We're not clear, right?
Say more about that, Addys. Be specific, right? Shared language about what?
Okay, share language about, let's be honest. If we're talking about anti-Blackness, we're talking about racism. We're talking about racism. I'm not talking about just anti-bias. We're talking about racism. And when I say racism, we're talking about an ideology about whiteness being the ideal and Blackness being at the bottom. We got to understand that that's what we're talking about and being clear that racism has very different forms, right? But it's hard to get on point with that because we all come into this conversation of racism from a very personal and emotional one. So we don't hear each other because all we can hear is what we've experienced, right? So I think about trainings like the Latino Challenge for Racial Justice, like Undoing Racism. It's important to have a space for grounding with some facilitators that are just there to hold the space for you so y'all can get an understanding of how did we get here? It's important to understand history. Quite often, we want to undo racism. We don't even have a definition, a working definition that's shared by the whole group. You can ask us right now, what is racism? And we would type up, if it's 28 of us, it'd be 28 different definitions. So what ends up happening is kind of like going back to my analogy. We want to go to Disney. We want to go to Disney, but we're not clear which Disney we going to. Some of us are going to end up in Paris, Tokyo, Orange County, because we weren't clear about, well, what Disney we going to, right? We just know we want to go to Disney. When we have conversations about racial equity, we even have that language gets bastardized because now people don't even say racial equity. They just say things like cultural equity or just equity and equity for all. Like we're somehow dismissing the conversation about race. And why are we making this about race? You invited me to an anti-Black conversation. That's the conversation that we having. Everything is about race. But you won't understand that if you don't have a context and a history that goes behind that. I mentioned before, right, that this idea of race predates the formulation of the United States. Yes, the truth is race was being codified as racism was being implemented. Those two things were happening simultaneously, but the actual codification of what race is something that came way later to justify the treatment and solidify white supremacy for what it is. So to get to that space lane that you're talking about working together, it means creating some very bold and intentional spaces and inviting people you know to begin with. Because if they buy in, they're going to invite people they know. And then those people are going to invite people they know. And that's how we start to grow. But it requires that, one, we recognize that it's going to be uncomfortable as hell.
Mm-hmm.
People are like, I'm looking for a safe space. No, you're looking for comfort. You're not looking for safety, because in this space, no one's going to attack you. No one's going to run up on you. This is not Bad Girls Club. This is not no reality show. People can have the conversation, What happens is somebody's going to say something and it's going to poke at your sensibilities, and you're going to shut up and you're going to get on your phone, or you're going to leave and go to the bathroom. Nah, it requires us also committing to staying the whole time for the conversation, being comfortable making mistakes in that space, and understanding that all of us have a very different experience. And because of that different experience, we're going to have to give each other something we don't normally give. And that's grace.
Grace and
We got
courage.
I can't have this conversation with Nick in the room and not challenge Nick and be like, hey, Nick, I don't like you using the word slave during a conversation if we're not in a relationship, right? We gotta be okay with that, so that Nick don't be like, oh, you're trying to play me. Because quite often what happens is we want to have these conversations without relationship, and people feel like they're being attacked. Then the wall goes up, conversation over. So I challenge people to start having these bold conversations with people they love, creating a space, bring food into it, set some ground rules, and go to a training where y'all all can get some shared language if you don't already have one. But to have this conversation, y'all got to have an understanding of what it is we talking about, and being real clear that this is what it is that we're talking about. Because if I'm talking about racism as a system and you talking about discrimination of being queer, I'm gonna be like, well, talk about being queer and Black, and then we can have this conversation. See, the dynamic changes when you start adding the lens of race. So being very clear and intentional.
So let me just thank you for that. And let me just say that what you have said, now we have 3 people in the queue and only less than 20 minutes now to answer all of that. I want to say thank you, Addys. So you're talking about you mentioned 2 anti-racism workshops, Undoing Racism and Latinx Challenges. Both can be Googled, and I will put both of that information in the chat. But it's very important to get into some of these trainings, and not just once, but multiple times, because our racial wounding goes very deep for all of us. And we will always discover something new, and also to share the information that we learn and what we discovered with each other. So I hear that. Thank you so much for that.
So we have,
let's do it.
Yeah, we have 3 questions, and I want to ask the person asking the question and the person answering the question if we could be as brief as possible so we can get as much in as possible in these next few minutes. So the first hand up was Cody. What's your question?
Thank you. And I have so many questions. I could take up all the rest of the time, but first I want to thank Lane for continuing with this, and for finding AJ, and for finding these 2 wonderful speakers. It was terrific. My comment in the chat about colonization and colonialism being the root of all the evils it still goes, and how to fight that because it's centuries old. That's a question. Another question I had was that early on you talked to Addys, and later you talked, Nick, about mejorando la raza. And I'd like to know more about that. So maybe I'll just leave it there. I want to say one last thing, and that is that in Puerto Rico, the language is Spanish. Is that correct for the most part, or is it Spanish and English both? Yeah. In Guatemala, where my son is from, there are 23 Mayan dialects, and the powers are always white Latinos, and the Garifuna, the escaped slaves, are the very bottom of the echelon. Okay, so that's it.
Yeah, just to answer that question quickly, mejorando la raza is sort of a colloquial phrase that you'll find amongst a lot of Latino communities, but essentially mejorando la raza means to better the race, to make the race better, which then translates to the way in which you make the race better is that you marry, or you have children, or you create families, more specifically with white men. So really what it was like a lot of Latina women to like pursue dating white men specifically, so that you can lighten the race, or what we hear is also el blanqueamiento, which is like to make the race whiter or to lighten the race. Mejorando la raza is anything that you can do within your personal family life to make the race better.
Next question is Daphne.
Thank you so much. And thank you. This is so validating. And as someone who's of Puerto Rican descent and born here and very Americanized, because I'm the 2nd generation born here, this really validates my experience. And I guess my question is, I'm part of 3 organizations, community organizations, all represented on this call. And in those conversations that we have, it's very much embedded in conversations about racism, but specifically speaking to the Black experience here in America. And it's obviously a real good reason for that conversation. Is there space and is there necessity to bring in the Latin experience without it invalidating, right, the experience of our African American brothers and sisters who obviously have suffered tremendously under our government? So just wanted to ask that.
Hell yes, that's a must. Just recently in 2018 in the state of Connecticut, young people were fighting with the legislators who were trying to implement an African American history class and a Latino history class, right? So eventually they lost their cojones, for lack of a better term, and they shrunk the class into just one. And we were asking them to speak about that history, intertwine it with the timeline so folks understand how we have more shared in common than not. But they were like adamant, that no, we need to separate these so that folks see this as separate. And that's kind of been the trick all along. They like to tell us our history separately so that we don't see how much, oh shoot, you too? So that year that they were doing this to us in 1952, they were doing this to you guys. And then over here, see, it's almost like a ploy. So that's a reason when I think about the work of organizing in Black communities, I find like I can step into that room because of how I present. I present as a fair-skinned light woman in their eyes, right? But when I go into my own community, yo soy la morena. Like, oh, you over there, we don't want to hear what you got to say. I find it much easier to have that conversation in a Black space, but oftentimes that conversation gets complicated because of one thing. When people think Latino, they don't think you and me, Daphne. They think white. They think, oh, you're talking about white Latinos. Because they look at us and they go, duh, you included in this too. But when they think of Latinos, because inherently when Latinidad is rooted in white supremacy, right? But that is more reason to one, create allyship with other folks of color, especially Black folks, to have a joint conversation together. Because it's not a oppression Olympics. It's really we got some shared history that we got to talk about. They did it to the Tuskegee study, gave y'all syphilis. They came to the island and sterilized our women. Holy shit, they've been doing both of us dirty. That's the conversation we need to have in parallel.
Thank you.
And we have one more question from, I hope I don't mispronounce your name, Saja? Did I say it right?
That is our beloved Saja. Yes.
Okay, there you go.
And I think Saja might be the last question. Let's just see.
Yes, yes. Well, the last one right now. Yeah.
Mine's more of observation, I think. When you started speaking about speaking the same language, definition-wise, I didn't hear that you were speaking of definition. I thought you were talking about literally language. And when I lived in Panama and was robbed, I had to bring a Spanish-speaking person to speak for me at the police station because I didn't speak Spanish. And I guess on a rational level, maybe it's English rational or something, but I felt like that made sense. Here, I have friends who speak different languages, and it's really only the ones that speak it well enough I can understand it, because I feel like communicating is what it's about, not I as a primary language is what I'm saying. And if I can't understand you or you can't understand me, then it's a lot more difficult unless it's through art or dance or something. So, but what I'm kind of coming around to now, as you talk, is that there is none of this is wrong, that we need to find the goodness in all of this, including things like even understanding capitalism, as difficult as that is for me to say, because I'm hearing my neighbor, who is a very small businessman, who is a Trumper, saying, feeling like he's getting stepped on because something about his disgruntled feelings are not being seen or heard or something. And so I feel like it's getting back to what Nic said, which is having to do with, on a heart level or a feeling level, we need to honestly and openly and vulnerably see and hear each other. That's all I had to say.
Thank you for, go ahead.
No, go ahead, AJ.
Oh, no, I wanted you to respond if you wanted to. Did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, thank you for that vulnerability and thank you for sharing that comment. I think it goes back to a point that Addys brought up, which is, one of the fundamental levels that we have to have when we're talking about these issues is to have a level of grace in our conversation. This work has not been easy. I know, like, Addys and I, we have established a relationship where we trust each other enough, where we can go back and forth with each other, but I mean, we've had, even within Colectivo Bambula, moments of which we've had to hold each other accountable. So I would say there's that level of grace and there's also accountability. And part of accountability is being willing to make yourself vulnerable, to hear, to feel something that maybe might make you feel uncomfortable. And to Ali's point earlier, even mentioning, I mentioned earlier that language evolves and language change. White supremacy is integrated within our language and how we move, how we think, how we function. I didn't even realize that I used the word slave, right? And I try to be intentional by using enslaved people or people who were kidnapped. But even just that highlight of that, right? That showcases how insidious it is, even in our language, of how we are disseminating this information. And it takes folks that you are in community with to call you out with that grace, with that account. And I have to be open enough to be held accountable of that moment. And even myself, as I know how I look, I don't look like Addys. I don't look like my grandfather. I don't look like my siblings. So even in space, when I'm talking about race, I have to be hyper conscious about how much space I take up in the conversation and what my role is in that conversation. So thank you for sharing that. And to your neighbor, what I've said is the play of politics, right? Those who are in political power will feed upon those who are the most distressed, those who are the most disgruntled, those who feel the sort of most disenfranchised, and will use that sort of sentiment of disenfranchisement to continue these politics that oppress sort of other people. And so going back to that question of like, yeah, we are going, things like capitalism, colonialism, racism, white supremacy, these are very large words with long histories that tomorrow we are not gonna have, even at the end of the conversation today, we're not gonna have the answers to. But I feel encouraged because what I do find now, because of technology like this, I would have probably never been able to be in a room with all of you if it was not for this technological space. So I want to encourage us to think about the ways in which technology can be continued to use for connection, that we can be in space with each other, that we can use the different forms of technology. Now, the reason why conversations like capitalism and white supremacy and colonialism feel like everybody's talking about it is because everybody is now. These are all issues that have existed and people have studied and there are scholars, but I think the difference is the access to have mass conversation is much easier. And so I do feel this energy that we are catching up to this conversation. But I encourage folks to continue. I know somebody wrote in the comments, shout out to Uncle Bobby's bookstore in Philadelphia. This is where I got this shirt. I tell folks, read, pick up a book. Pick up a book. There are worlds and worlds that you will be introduced to. And you don't have to actually physically read. You can use Audible. You can see text. If you're not a reader like that, there are these technologies now that I think make community building happen much easier and quicker.
So if it all possible in 2 minutes or less, can you give us, like, what would be a call to action? How would you want people here to get involved? And I know that's a longer answer, but we limited time.
I'll take the challenge just really quickly. 2 minutes or less, pick up a book. I would say go to a bookstore, go to a Black-owned bookstore, go to a Latino-owned bookstore, solicit these places. And I say go to these bookstores because they will have the books that larger book carriers will not have. And they will have multiple books. So pick up a book if you're interested. I just want to start learning. call to action, pick up a book. Another call to action, this is more personal because this is sort of on the forefront of my mind. If you want to donate to the causes in Puerto Rico, please do not donate to any government organizations that are currently right now. There are a number of collective organizers and community-based organizers in Puerto Rico who will make sure those funds will get directly to the people. What we're finding that's happening.
Can you share a link? If you can
Yeah.
share a link. Yeah.
I'll type a couple of those links where folks can share to in the chat box for sure. So yes, keep your eyes and ears to the ground, to the folks on the ground doing this work. I'd say really quickly, pick up a book. There's a great book called, and I'll write this down too, When the Irish Became White by Noel Ignatieff. It's a really great book if folks are interested in learning about how white people became white in the United States. And this case study focuses on specifically when was the shift that happened when Irish folks in the United States were all of a sudden considered white and why that happened. That's a really great sort of framing and context. I'll write all of that in the chat box.
Lane, would you like to close us down?
No, actually, I want to make sure Addys also
I'm sorry.
says some closing words. How would you like
Yes.
to get us involved? How can we follow you, the both of you as well? We need to make sure that we get all of your information, okay? So
No problem. I would say if you want to stay in contact with us, do so through Instagram. Colectivo Bambula has a page up there. I'm trying to remember what the page, and I'm sure Nick will just put it in the chat. We also have a Facebook page. We're going to get back into holding space virtually. I think that's the blessing and the curse that came with COVID is that, oh my God, we got to be virtual, but it actually created a platform for us to connect with folks from all over. We're going to continue with more discussions about anti-Blackness, more learning discussions. And with time, we're looking to be able to organize Latinos here in the mainland on how, and from the diaspora, how do we support movement building in places like Puerto Rico, right? Especially, I want to be, if you're going to do this work, I want you to make a personal commitment to yourself. Not even to me, to yourself, because this is much more about you. This work to me is much more personal. I'm grateful for El Colectivo Bambula. I feel enriched by my relationships with the other partners who are at the table. I think I opened this conversation stating that there was a time when I was resenting what it is to be Latina. And I can tell you that today that's a completely different, I'm not even there. Me and Nick had a chance to walk in the Puerto Rican Day Parade in New York City this year. And you know who we were doing it next to? AOC. And it was so powerful to see the level of energy and around her, specifically because she felt so genuine in the way that she was trying to engage with the people in the audience and with us even to uplift the work that's happening on the island. What I appreciate about what her platform is that even though she represents New York, she stays connected to the work that's happening on the ground in Puerto Rico and uses her positional power and her position in general to connect others. I would, challenge you all in this call who have networks, who have assets, who have friends that are doing things, to stay connected to the people who are doing work on the ground. I see Annie's on the call. Annie's moving some of this work on the ground because it's one thing to get language and it's another thing to operationalize the learning. Because most of us read a book and we get stuck in analysis paralysis. Do your healing work, but don't get stuck there. Don't just stay there reading books and be like, hey, this is my contribution to the movement. And yeah, the contribution can also be financial, but the contribution feels even much more genuine when you start dedicating your time to it and building relationship with people who don't look like you.
Thank you very much. And I didn't mean to uninclude you. I was watching the clock for Lane. She got me watching the clock real hard. So I was trying to keep it together. But thank you very much. Thank you both. Thank you very much, both of y'all. I've learned a lot today. Like I do with every interview I do, I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot today. This
has been a very affirming, loving conversation. Thank you so much to both of you, Addys Castillo and Nic Rodriguez Villafane. And I hope that I have been pronouncing your name correctly, Nick. Okay, thank you. Please, we won't be with you next week. Please join us on October 19th at noon for another episode of Race Talk. We're going to be talking about Indigenous people's rights. If you'd like to support for your walk, Please join us for Race Talk in Action. We're going to meet tomorrow night at 7 o'clock on Zoom. I will put that in the chat as well. You can find that on Eventbrite, Race Talk in Action. Thank you, of course, to my co-host, Mr. AJ Woodson of Black Westchester Magazine. You can find more information about the magazine and People Before Politics Radio and AJ's book at blackwestchester.com. I am going to put a full link in the chat. If you're on our mailing list, please make sure that you look at our resources every week that we send out to you. That is a way for you to keep your learning going. And please share Race Talk with your friends. The more the merrier in this conversation. We need to make sure that we really are doing, as Addys says, our work and holding each other accountable. Lastly, if you have topics or speakers that you'd like us to feature, please contact us at info@racetalkrevolution.com. Absolutely so happy to have you, Ms. Addys Castillo and Nic Rodriguez Villafane. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Please don't be strangers. We want you to come back. Let us know if there are voices that we should lift up in the future as well. Please do that. Please stay in touch. Thank you, everybody, for a wonderful broadcast. All right, have a great 2 weeks, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye, everybody.